Hello, I'm Kyle Stallones. It's March 15, 2023. We're here at the Tomball Museum Center in the Tice house, and we're here to visit with Mr. Edwin Butch Tice today. And this is part of the museum's oral history project, recording the recollections of the Tomball residents that have shaped and formed the history of this great town in northwest Harris County. You can view this video and others at our YouTube channel at Tomball Museum. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Tice. Could you tell us your full name?
My full name is Edwin G. Tice. Everybody calls me Butch.
And how'd you get that nickname?
Well, when I was a little baby, I had a pootsed a lot, and my daddy started calling me Poots, and then it went to Pootsy Bunch, and then finally Bunchy, and then it ended up Butch, then Butchie when I was in high school. But I've been sticking with the name Butch, but most all of my friends that I went to high school called me Butchie.
Thanks. And what year were you born?
I was born November 19, 1928, and I was born over on the Spring Cypress Road, just east of 249. When you cross the railroad track on the left-hand side, my father owned 56 acres there, and the house that I was born in is a Tice house over at the Wonderlick Museum next to the Dory School.
Is that house anywhere near like this one, or is it a little bit different?
No, it's typical in the 20s house type thing. It's not nothing like this.
And what was your wife's name?
My wife's name was Billie Jean Armstrong.
And what year did y'all get married, do you recall?
We got married, I have to think a bit.
Yeah.
April 14th, 1950.
And whereabouts did y'all get married?
We got married in a Trinity Lutheran Church over at Clyde.
Did you have any kids?
Oh yeah, I have 4 children. I have a son who is a dentist, and he lives in Nacogdoches, Texas, and I have twin daughters, and one of them is living with me, and the other one is married. The one that's living with me never has got married, and then I have a younger daughter named Sandy, and she's not married either.
Any other kids?
Do they have any kids?
Do you have any other kids?
Have what?
Any other children?
No, that's all.
That's all. What were their names again?
Well, the son's name was Ronald. We call him Ronnie. And the daughter, the twins, the one that was born first is LaVon, and the other one is Yvonne, and the youngest one is Sandra.
Thanks. And do you have great-grandkids?
Yes, I have 5 great-grandkids.
Where do you live now?
I live on Tice Bell Route Road, same place on the same road that my great-grandfather lived on.
All right. And what was your dad's name?
My dad's name was John Edwin.
And what was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Rosa Elizabeth Scherer Tice.
And where were the Scherers from?
The Scherers came from Germany over here, and actually they got here about 3 months before the Tice family, and they lived here at Tomball. In fact, they lived just right down the street here, Epps and Baker Street on the right-hand side, and my Grandpa William Scherer owned a store here in Tomball, and I could tell you a whole lot of things about him.
What kind of store did he have?
It was a grocery store, I think, and maybe a saloon too.
Where was it located?
It was, as I remember, it was about where Baker goes into Main Street.
Did it later become another name store that we might know?
No, I don't think. I think it ended up being a. I think they even may have had rooms there for people to stay in, kind of like a hotel.
Is that the same sharers that own the land out by Spring Creek Park?
Yes, that's the same sheriffs.
All right. Did they farm out there? What did they do with that
Yeah,
land?
they farmed out there, and I think my grandpa, I think he farmed some over there, and then when he moved here in Tomball, he farmed right here in this area. But then he went into store business, as I recall.
And do you know how much land he had here in town?
It was not that big, probably around 25 acres.
Your dad lived right there on Spring Cypress Road most of the time?
Yeah. Well, at one time they lived on Louetta Road, and until he and my mother got married in 1916, and I don't know if they lived right away there or they built a house there probably later, but they lived there until 1923, and my brother and two sisters were born there, and then in 1924, Dad built that house on Spring Cypress, and that's where I was born.
So the earlier house was over near Louetta Road?
Yeah, it was on Louetta Road.
Was
About right close to Champion Forest Drive.
So it's still east of 249.
Yeah.
Back then it was 149,
Yeah.
I guess. I heard of the Louetta community. Where was that?
Well, Louetta was actually my birth date, shows me born in Louetta, Texas, my birth certificate. And it was right there at Spring Cypress, where it crosses the railroad track. And there was a depot just south of Spring Cypress, and at one time it was a post office there, and then it was moved to right there on the corner of Louetta and Spring Cypress. There was a store called the Jones Store, and I remember it very well. And that was before rural-free delivery came in, and you had to go there and pick up your mail there, a post office box. And then when the rural-free delivery came in, well, they closed a lot of post offices, and that one was closed, and then we started getting our mail from Fairbanks, Texas. And then later it came from Spring.
And back then, was there a Klein community?
Oh yeah, Klein community started way back in, I guess, probably about 1846, somewhere along in there. It was, at one time it was called Big Cypress, Texas. And then it became Klein, and Klein had a post office. When Adam Klein came over, well, later years he petitioned the government to put a post office there, and they did, and it was called Klein. That's how Klein got its name.
All right, so we talked about some of the names of your siblings. What were their names? How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had two sisters and one brother, and one of them was named, the oldest was my brother, he was the oldest, and he was born, I think, in 1917, and then
What was his name?
Victor Tice, and then my oldest sister was born about 3 years after him, and she was a Edabay Klein. She married a Klein, it wasn't the same Kleins as, there was another Klein family besides the original ones. And then my younger sister was Gladys, and she married a man named Marcus Hackenback. And I was the 7 years younger than she was, and my daddy always called me top crop. I was his top crop. And I remember a man up here in Tomball asked, met Dad one day, one Saturday, and he said, well, Ed, they call him Ed. He said, Ed, you got a good-looking boy. That's your boy, I suppose. He said, yeah. Dad said, that's my top crop. What do you mean top crop? He said, well, you know, every 7 years you usually have a real good crop of cotton. Back then, in those days, they used to be a lot of cotton farming here around Tomball and Klein. And I remember picking cotton when I was just a little boy. But then in 1936, they stopped cotton farming around here. And so that's the reason why he called me his top crop, because I guess because I was 7 years younger than my sister.
Great. So we talked about your parents. Let's go back. What's your granddad's name?
My granddad's name was Jacob Tice. My great grandfather was Jacob Tice, and he was Jacob the first. And then my dad was John Edwin, and he had a brother named Jacob, and his was Jacob the third. And of course, he had several sisters too.
All right. So, what did your grandfather do around the area?
My grandfather was basically a sawmill man. He owned a sawmill, and of course he farmed too. But he did sawmilling, and it kind of ran in the family. My dad ended up owning the sawmill over at Klein. It was called Kleb and Tice Lumber Company. My uncle was a Kleb that came from up around Tomball, Rose Hill area. There was some Klebs up here, and then there's some Klebs down at Klein. So they went together, and they went into the sawmill business. And before that time, my dad worked for Jacob Strock. At one time, it was on Louetta Road, where the Strock family lived. But then later, he moved over to on Newman Airline there, right where the Hedon feed mill is. That's where the sawmill was. And my dad worked there for a long time. He was a sawyer, what they called a sawyer, one that operated the saw blade and stuff, and the logs rolled up on there, and he set the blocks and stuff and pulled back on us. And then the mill would go forward and cut the log up.
All right. And how about your great-grandfather? What was his name?
He was Jacob Tice.
Jacob Tice. And
he farmed, and he lived over on the Stubner Airline, right there where Tice Mail Road is. He owned when they came over here from Germany, he bought 587 acres. And I still live on some of that property. And my grandfather also lived over there, and there was a couple of other boys that lived there that I think he gave all of them some land.
So what was your grandmother's name?
My grandmother was a Kenley.
How do you spell that?
Kuehnle.
And where was their family from?
They were from Germany.
Yeah. Where did they live around here?
Well, Kenleys, most of them lived over on Louetta Road, just east of Kirkendall Road. Before she was born, before she married, I can't remember what her maiden name was, but she married a Kinley.
So I had her as being Rosina Kinley, and she married Jacob Tice Jr., is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
And her father was Jacob Kinley, and then there was a John Kinley, and they both were in the Confederate Army, and they got back home. My great grandfather Kinley, he died shortly after. He came home from wounds, and he died very shortly after that.
All right, then backing up to Jacob Tice Sr., was his wife Elizabeth?
Yeah, she was a Metzler, and there was a lot of Metzlers up here around Tomball.
Was that kin to Dr. Metzler up here?
Yes, yeah, they were kin, and Jack Metzler, he was constable up here for a long time, and then Allie Tice ran against him and won, and then Allie became the constable.
And then Jacob Tice Sr.'s dad was it Johann Heinrich Tice?
Right, Johann Heinrich.
And his wife was Katharina or Catherine?
Katharina.
Katharina. And whereabouts did they live?
They lived, when they first got here from Germany, they came over in 1846, and they bought property. It's a long story. When they left Germany, they arrived in Galveston. They left Germany on August the 4th and arrived at Galveston October the 9th. And their destination was New Braunfels. They belonged to what was called the Verein, and the Verein was a group that was sent over here to establish a place for people to live and get land after they arrived. And when they got here on October the 9th at Galveston, all ships had to come into Galveston before they could go to any other ports along the bay. And their ship went to Indianola. That's in the Matagorda Bay. And the record shows that they arrived there on December 9th, 1846. Well, I'm not so sure that they actually went on to Indianola because it was a deplorable conditions, and the Verein did a very good job of getting things ready before the ships started coming in. But according to family members, some of the older ones, they did go to Indianola. And when they arrived at Indianola, they found that it was deplorable. A lot of sickness and cold and rainy winter. And so I think that Johann Heinrich decided that the best thing to do is to try to come back. And the Verein, I think that, well, he inquired about the road to New Braunfels, and he was told that all you have to do is follow the bones, and they'll lead you right to it. Well, the bones wasn't human bones; they were animal bones, and according to what history I read, was that they had a lot of cold weather then, and many people died on the way there, and so it's my belief and belief of most of the family that they had to either come to this area at Clyde on a stagecoach, because at that time wagons were all bought up by the government. That was when the war with Mexico took place, and you couldn't get wagons or anything. So there were shuttle ships that come back from Indianola, and it's my belief that they came back on a shuttle ship, and then they made their way either by stagecoach from Galveston to Houston, or they got on a ship that come up Buffalo Bayou. And that's probably the way they came up. And the Shearer family had come here just about 3 months before they did. And they arrived in Houston, and they bought 200 acres of property in the Elizabeth Smith survey, and that survey is over here, starts at Husmith Corville Road, north of Willow Creek, and goes east to about Kirkendall, maybe a little across there, and there are 200 acres they bought there, and they finally got settled in, and I don't know if there was a house there or not, but if not, they had to probably had to build a log cabin or something. Anyway, they got settled in, and then they lived there, and until 1854 is when Jacob bought the property down there at Clyde. And
Jacob Tice.
Yeah, Jacob Tice, and then Johann Heinrich, he passed away, and I got records showing that his wife and Henry were listed on the tax records. And then later, I have records showing that it was Henry. Evidently, Henry inherited the property there because the youngest son, Christian, had always been kind of sickly, and I think he died at an early age. And Henry inherited that property, and then let's see, it was May 30th of 1862 that he sold that property to H.W. Whitfield for $500. And 3 days later, on June the 2nd, he was taken into the Confederate Army. It shows that he enlisted, but I don't believe he was in. I don't think he enlisted. I think he was picked up, because many of them around this area was picked up, and you had to go. If you did, they'd shoot you. And so he went in. He went on into the service, and according to records, he abandoned the army, and from what we found out, he was taken prisoner by the Union forces and was in a prison camp up in New York.
Was it Elmira?
Yes.
I heard that was pretty rough up there.
That's rough. And later on, when you interview John, well, he can tell you a lot about it. I know that he finally decided he was going to escape because the conditions were so deplorable that he knew that he was going to die if he stayed there, and he made his escape. Escape was successful, and he brought with him a blanket back. And John can tell you about that. That blanket is still in the family.
So going back to Johann Heinrich Tice. How did he spell his last name? With an S or a Z on the end?
It was S, single S.
Single S. How did it become two S's?
Well, when Henry moved up here, after he sold that property over there on Huntsville-Colville Road, and after he got back from the prisoner, being a prisoner, he bought 208 acres of property up here at Rose Hill, and he lived there. I think there might have been a house on that property because one day John's mother and Daddy and I and a few other people went up there and we found remnants of a old house, and later then he built this house in 1869.
That's the house we're in today.
That's
here
the
at
house
the museum.
we're in today.
And was it located along that road going to Salem Lutheran Church?
Yes, it's located, and then if you go down there now, turning off of 2920, after you go about a mile on the left-hand side, you could still see the power line that goes down there, and there's no house there. That's where the house was. And then across the road was where a sister lived, and she was married to C.W. Winkler. And Henry Tice, Jacob, C.W. Winkler, and George Scherer, my great-grandfather, they were the first ones to start Salem Lutheran Church. In fact, there's a historical marker up there now that tells all about it.
So what was the interaction between the folks at Klein and your German community with the folks at Salem?
Okay, it was very good. In fact, as far as the name now, the double S and the single S, Henry that owned it, lived in this house, he had a son named William, and Jacob, his brother, had a Tice named William down at Klein, and both of them were cotton farmers. And when they'd take their cotton into Houston, they would send the checks out, mail them out to them, and the one up here at Rose Hill, he would get the check that belonged to the one down at Clyde. So they made a gentleman's agreement. After that was, they'd have to get on a horse and buggy and go and exchange checks, and that would take a half a day or almost a whole day. So they made a gentleman's agreement that the one up here at Rose Hill would stay with a single S, and the one down at Klein would stay with a double S. Well, my dad's birth certificate shows that, and baptismal certificate shows his name was single S. And after that, everybody down at Klein followed suit and went with a double S. Of course, all those up here stayed with single S. And except my great-grandfather, Jacob, he never did change his double S. He stayed with single S.
So your birth certificate, does it show double S?
Yes. Yeah.
So how did it work between the Klein community, the Germans there versus in Salem? Did y'all go to Salem at first?
Well, yeah, back then, my great-grandfather that lived at Klein, he would come up here on a Saturday and travel up here by wagon, and I'm sure he would spend the night here with Henry and go to church and then go back home the next day. And there were some French people that lived on the road up here, and they commented, "That sure is a good man, traveling all the way up here to go to church.
That sounded like a pretty big journey back then.
Yeah. And then later years, when Trinity Lutheran Church was started down at Klein, Jacob was a charter member of that church.
That made it
And
a lot easier.
there was a number of other people that lived down at Klein that came up to Salem at the same time.
It made it easier when they had their own church closer, right?
Right.
Right.
That church was established in 1873, I believe it was.
Is that Trinity?
Yes.
So I've seen pictures of Tomball from way back, and it looked like there weren't hardly any trees anywhere. Was that the way kind of Tomball was back then?
Yeah, it was pretty much that way.
And how about the area where you lived near Klein? Was there many trees there?
Oh, yeah, there were a lot of trees down there.
So where were the timberlands where these sawmills were? Near the creeks?
Well, yeah, near the creeks, there were quite a few pine trees back then that was available. And Dad and them had to buy some timber a little further off, but most of it was pretty close by.
So we talked about the Tice house that we're in today and the Tice house you were born in that's in Wunderlich Farms Museum in Klein. And I understand that there was a third Tice house out here in Tomball, wasn't there? Out by where Walmart is now today?
Oh, yeah, that was Fritz Tice. He was a son of Henry Tice, and he had a house that was just like this, and it was over there where Walmart is. And he had a son named Allie Tice, who became the constable here, and I think Fritz also was a constable at one time. And Fritz, just so happened that Fritz married my grandpa William Sheriff's sister. So I'm kin to, Millie Martin and her family. We're related two ways. And of course, there was also another one of Allie's boys' name was Butch, same as mine.
That's what I wondered about. I've heard of another Butch over here in the Tomball area. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was Millie's brother?
Yeah, her brother.
All right. And so it's Millie Tice Martin?
Yeah.
And she was a granddaughter of Fritz Tice?
Yeah.
I read parts of your book, My Life in Klein. It's an interesting book. And you talked in there about Indian Hill. Where was Indian Hill?
Indian Hill was, you go down Kirkendall, right before you get to where you get to the creek, Spring Creek, off to the right, next to the creek. I don't know exactly how far it is, but there is a map. I don't have the map with me, but there is a map that shows Indian Hill. And there was an Indian camp there, and my father used to deer hunt a lot in those areas there, and they camped there at the Indian Hill, and they found.
Is that at number 69 on there? Looks like it's Indian Hill.
Let's see.
Looks like it would be right here.
Yeah, it's right in there.
Yeah.
That's where it is. It's right in there with it.
So this is in his book.
Yeah. I called the Texas Historical Association, and I tried to get them to, try to maintain that area or make it a park or something, but they said that I'd have to get some petitions signed and stuff, and I couldn't. I didn't do that.
So, did you research anything about the Indians and what were the names of the Indians, the tribe?
I don't know the name, but maybe. What's the name?
I've heard of Akokissa.
Yeah, something like
or
that.
Karankawa.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Did you ever hear any stories about the Indians that lived there?
Well, there's one story I heard a lady talk about. When she talked about the town of Spring, that there was a house that was up on Crocodile Road. It was set right up on a hill, and it was a family there that called the Millers or Muellers. And she baked bread, and one day she set the bread out on the front porch so it would cool down before supper. And she went back out there and the bread was gone. And she couldn't figure out what happened to it. Well, what it was, the Indians came up there and they got that bread, and then the next day she happened to go out on the porch and there was a catfish there. They brought her a catfish for the bread, so she started making some extra bread all the time and put it out on the porch, and they'd come and get the bread, and then they'd bring her some more fish.
Pretty good little trade there.
Yeah.
Do you know of any other Tice houses in this area? Was that about all?
Well, no, not only, some of my relatives that live over at Clyde.
Yeah.
There was in my book, you'll find a cotton gin, and it was called a Roth cotton gin, but it actually was A.J. Tice that had the cotton gin, and it closed down in 1936 when the cotton started. Roosevelt was the one the Germans, most of the German people didn't like Roosevelt because he stopped people from planting cotton and even paid them not to plant cotton. And one of the familiar things that they called was plied under, because Roosevelt said to plied under.
That put them out of the cotton raising business.
The cotton, back in those days, cotton was the main product worldwide, just like oil is today. And the Germans, people down at Clyde, they felt like it would work out itself if they could continue to plant cotton. But I don't know. I think maybe he was right, because it just got so much cotton they couldn't sell it.
Whereabouts was that cotton gin?
It was on the Rhodes Road. Rhodes Road. If you go down Spring Cypress to Kirkendall, you turn left. You go down there a little ways, and there's a signal light, and there's a road that cuts off to the right. And that's Rhodes Road. And all down there about a half a mile on the left-hand side is where the cotton gin was.
Do you know of
In
any
fact,
other?
his old house was still there recently. I think it may be gone now. I don't know, because his grandson Roger Wunderlich lived there next to it, but he lived in he had a brick house, but the old house he was raised in, and his mother and daddy lived in that old house for a long time. And I think they tried to give that house to the Wunderlich farm, but they've got all the houses in there now that they can have.
Do you know of any other cotton gins around this area?
Well, let's see. I think there was one up at probably up here Rose Hill somewhere. I don't remember where it was, but I think there was down about Cypress, down there somewhere. There might have probably was too.
We have one here in the barn that came from Springs.
Yeah, that's the old Winchy. Yeah, that was over there on Cypress Wood and I-45 on the west side. That's where that gin came from.
That's near where the old blimp base used to be, but on the
Yeah,
other
right close to it.
east of I-45 instead
right
of west.
close to it.
Yeah. So in your book, you talked about Dr. Earhart's office, and we have his office right here in our museum complex now.
Yeah, well, Dr. Earhart's office used to be on 1960, and it was, I remember him very well. He's the one that delivered me. And when I was in the Army in 1950 through 52, I went in 50 and got out in 52. I got the poison ivy all over me, and I was in Fort Polk, Louisiana. At that time it was called Camp Polk. But I got, and man, that place was just covered with poison oak and poison ivy, and I got it all over my body. And they covered me with calamine lotion when I was over there, and then when I came home on a weekend, I thought I'd go to him because, man, it was still so bad. And I went to him, and he looked at it, and he said, "Son, there's just not anything you can do other than calamine lotion." And he mixed up some and gave me a bottle of it. And that was the last time I saw him, but he was a good doctor.
Where was his office back then?
It was on 1960, about where, I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but there's a Walmart store on 1960 on the left-hand side going towards I-45. And right there where that Walmart store was where his office was. And a real nice big house was out there, and then he had this little office outside.
So I've seen inside our museum, his office here in our museum, in the back it looked like where he had his bottles of different medicines. So I also read about you were treated once by Dr. McPhail here in Tomball.
Yeah, McPhail. McPhail's office was down here on Main Street. It was right next to where the theater was at one time, and he had a pharmacy there, and we came up here one Saturday. Well, no, we got a letter or card from my aunt in Houston and telling me about my cousin had just got out of the hospital, and his appendix had ruptured. And so the next morning, I was hurting down in here. And so Daddy brought me up here and went to McPhail, and he had me to lay on the table, and he took his hand and he pushed down on there and come up with it. Man, I like to jump off the table. And he told my daddy, he said, "He's got appendicitis. You're going to have to take him to the hospital." Well, that was during the Depression years, and didn't have any money or anything, too much money, and so he called Ben Taub. It was called, at that time, it was called Jefferson Davis Hospital. And he called there and let them know that we were going to be coming in. And we went in there, and my mother and I, we sat there almost all day, and they took blood samples. I don't know how many times they punctured my finger, getting blood, and finally about 8 o'clock that night, I think they took me into the operating room and operated on me, and I stayed in the hospital, I guess, about 7 days, and they brought me, came back home, and you wouldn't believe it, but at that time they didn't get you up the next morning. I had to stay in bed for 3 weeks. And when I finally got ready to get out of the bed and get up and walk, my mother had to hold on to me. I almost had to learn how to walk again. And then there was another time that I went to MacPhail. We came up here and we went by my uncle, Wilbert Michael. He lived down here on 249 on the left-hand side, across from where the Millard Ford Chevrolet used to be. It became Parkway. And we stopped in there to talk to him, and next thing you know, my leg got real red, and all the way up to here. I had on short pants, and so Uncle Wilbert said, Ed, I think you need to take that boy to the doctor. So we came up here to Dr. MacPhail, and he looked at it, he said, you got erysipelas. Now, erysipelas comes from either sheep or hogs. It's some kind of a mite or something that gets in your skin, and he took some salicylic acid, I guess it was, and he painted my whole leg, and man, I'm telling you, it burned like fire. But it wasn't no time it left. So we went back to my uncle, and as soon as we got back there, this other leg started. So we had to go back to him again, and he did the same thing, painted it with that, and it left.
Had pretty rough treatments back then.
Oh, I mean, it was tough back in those days. The doctors and stuff, you know.
Yeah. So I heard Dr. MacPhail was he kin to our teacher here at Business Calvert. I think she was a MacPhail.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the McDougals over there near where your house was in Klein. The McDougall family?
Yeah.
I heard they had a little paper on the wall of that Wonderlick Farms Museum saying he was in the Texas Rangers for a short amount of time. Did you ever hear any stories about him or his family?
Yes, I heard some stories about him. I know one of them was a county commissioner for a while, and I know exactly where the McDougalls lived. There was one McDougall family lived on Spring Cypress Road, just east of 249, where Husmith Corville crossed the Spring Cypress, just a little ways east on the right-hand side was a McDougall lived there. And then on Stubner Airline, Oakwood Glen, I think it is on the right-hand side, right across the road, there was the McDougall family lived there, and they were the first people to come here to Klein. They got here in 1843. That's what I understand.
Yeah, I've seen that cemetery there in the church parking lot.
Yeah, that cemetery is back in there.
Well, let's back up a little bit. When you were in grade school, where did you go to school?
Well, I went to Trinity Lutheran Parochial School from the 1st grade to the 8th grade. And then after the 8th grade, I went to Klein High and graduated from Klein High.
Where was the parochial school?
The what?
Parochial school?
It was right there next to Trinity Lutheran School. I think there's a picture in my book there.
Did you play any sports in school?
Oh yeah, I played a lot of sports. I played in basketball at Klein. I lettered 4 years. And then I graduated in May of 1947. And they started football in September. And I was always wanting them to start having football at Clyde, but never did happen while I was there. In fact, Tomball, some of the boys at Tomball tried to get me to come to Tomball. I was a pretty good athlete, but I didn't. I talked to the superintendent, and he kind of talked me out of it. And so after I graduated and they started football, then I had a job in Houston at the United Gas reading meters. And I had heard about that they were going to start football, and I came into the store down there at Spring Cypress and Stubner, the Kleb store, and the superintendent was in there, and he said, "Butch, I guess you heard we're going to start football." And I said, "Yeah, I know. I heard about it." And I said, "I knew you ought to start as soon as I graduated." And he said, "Well, you could still play." I said, "Well, how am I going to play? The UIL's not." He, "No, we're not going to play in any district the first year. We're going to just pick up whatever games we could get." And he said, "You could come back and take some extracurricular activities." So I said, "Well, I don't know if my daddy'd go along with that." He said, "Well, talk to your daddy. If I see him, I'll talk to him." He said, "I'd like to see you come back. We need all the help we can to get it started." So I went home and I told my dad, and he said, "But boy, you can't go to high school all your life." I said, "Well, Daddy, I know that." I said, my desire was to be a coach. And this way, this would be a good chance for me to learn something about football so I could go to college." Well, he said, "Well, all right, I guess it's okay." So I went back and played the first year. And ended up, but I never did go to college. I went to work for Southwestern Bell, and I worked for them for 38 years.
What did you do for them?
Well, I started out as a cable splicer's helper, and then I promoted to a splicer, and then I went into installation, transferred to residential installation, and then I became a PBX installer.
What is PBX?
What is it? Well, that's switchboards and stuff. And I did that for a number of years, and then I got promoted to supervisor, and I was up here at Tomball for about 7 months, I guess, or 8. I was a supervisor up here, but I had a boss, a second line boss, that I just couldn't get along with him very well. He was a hard man to work for. And so finally I just told him I wanted to go back to craft. So I went back, and after I went back, there was 4 more that worked for him that went back. And I don't know, it looks to me like that plant manager would have found out that there's something wrong, all these guys wanting their tools back. In fact, he called me in the office and asked me why I didn't wanted to go back. Well, I didn't want to say anything against the guy, so I told him, I said, well, I just didn't feel like I was cut out to be a supervisor, and I just decided I'd like to go back to craft. So he said, well, you got a perfect record as a craftsman. He said, I hate to lose you, but that's what you want, okay.
So earlier we were talking about that chair you're sitting in here. Can you tell us about that chair?
Well, this chair belonged to my great-grandfather, Jacob Tice, and he got the chair when he was living with his youngest son down in the valley at the Bishop, Texas. And of course, after he passed away, the chair stayed there for years, and his youngest son then passed away, and one of the family members knew about this house, and so they knew all about the Henry Tice and Jacob, and so they donated it to this house.
Great. You were involved in the Tomball Museum for a while, weren't you?
Yes, I was here. I belonged to I was on the board here for about 30 years.
From roughly what years were that? From 90, I think. Your daddy wanted me on this board right away. And they brought me. They elected me in '89, but then he called me one day and he said, "Butch, I'm sorry to tell you this, but according to bylaws, you have to be a member here for a year." So he says, "We're going to have to release you," and he said, "But I want you back on here after a year." So after a year, they put me back. So I stayed on here for 30 years. I helped, Billy Martin and I was instrumental in getting this house brought over here. And that's when he wanted me to come on the board. And then I got this, I got the man that moved the house, the mover. I was able to get him to help get this house moved over here. Oscar Neidick and I did a lot of work at getting this house moved here. And then I got a smokehouse that we wanted, and I found one down here, and I got it and had it moved over here. Was that Lester Neidick or Oscar Neidick?
Lester, that's who it was. Right. Oscar was his father. Yeah, Lester, that's who it was.
All right. So where did the smokehouse come from?
It came from right down the street here. The man that owned the house, he lived in Houston, and I called him and told him that we'd like to have a smokehouse, and I said that if you'd like to donate it, it would be a good part for you to do that. But I don't know. I think we ended up having. I don't remember if we had to pay him anything or not. I think he donated it. And I got the same mover that moved this house here to move that.
Roughly, what year did y'all move this house over here to the museum?
'89.
All right. Can you tell us how a younger guy like me doesn't know how they used the smokehouse? How did they use it?
Smokehouses?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I can tell you all about that. We had a smokehouse at my house. In fact, it's still over there at Warnock Museum. The house that I was born in is sitting right there, and then the smokehouse is right next to it, and a windmill. And whenever it came time for butchering in the winter, sometime around November, you know, it used to get cold here. Early part of September, it started getting the cold fronts blowing in, and by November it was cold. And so we always had hogs, and had them all fattened up and everything, and cold front would blow in like on a Friday evening, and Daddy and they'd already have everything ready to go when a cool front blew in, and they had to get up in the morning and go out there and take that big round black pot and put a fire around it and fill it up with water, and then get up, and we got the sled hooked up to the mule and had a black man that worked for us, and go out there, and Daddy would shoot 2 hogs in the head with a .22, and then after they got down on the ground, he'd cut the gurgler vein and bleed them out real good, and load them on the sled and bring them up there, and they had a 50-gallon barrel that we kind of dig out a little bit dirt and put that bottom of that barrel up against that ground and put a block underneath it where it would be elevated up, and then fill it up with hot water, and he'd take some ashes and put in there, because ashes had a little bit of acid in it, and then take that hog and stick it down in there and turn it around and around, and then pull it out, and of course he'd have to have some help, and then stick the head down in there and turn it around and around, and then pull it out and put it up on a table, and then you could scrape the hair off of it. And then that would be one of the jobs I had to do, is start scraping on it. And then after I got it scraped off real good, both of them, take it in we had a garage there, and then hang them up and gut them out, and then lay them on the table and cut it up, and he'd grind out. My job was to turn that grinder and grind that meat up for sausage, and then he'd mix that sausage up in a big tub, you know, and he had a recipe, and put salt in there, and then he'd had a dish out there, and he'd take a handful of that sausage and put on there, and they'd say, okay, take this in the house and have Mama to fry it up and bring it out here and let's taste it. So she'd fry it up and bring it out there, and both of them would taste it. My mother might say, I think it needs a little bit more salt. Yeah, I think so too, and he'd put a little bit more salt in it.
You know where his recipe came from?
Huh?
Where did his recipe come from?
Well, I think he had his own recipe, or he might have got it from somebody else. But anyway, he made good sausage, and then we call it liverwurst. Wurst in German is sausage, and he'd take the head and the liver, the kidneys, and grind it all up and make that what they call liver sausage. And I liked it about as good as I did that other sausage. Mm-hmm. And then after we got it sausage made up, and you know, we had that stuffer and stuffed the sausage. Then if you look at that smokehouse, you'll see some sticks up there. You'd have to take string and tie it around that sausage and hang it up in there, and then we'd have a tub that put in there and build a fire, and then put that tub over it and snuff that fire out where it was just smoke, and then let it smoke all night long, then maybe a little bit the next day, and then that's the way to do it.
How long did you have to smoke it for?
Well, about 12, 13 hours.
And how about when you were smoking ham? Did that take? How long did that take?
About the same time.
Same. And I guess they used that because they didn't have as much refrigeration back then.
That's it. We'd eat sausage during the winter time, and then when the spring came, we'd always have some sausage left over, and my mother would take them off and cut them in lengths about like that, and put them in a jar, and take some lard. And of course, we'd render the lard too, and put the lard in that, and then keep that sausage in there and eat it during the summer.
Did y'all have any German traditions passed down, or any of the family from your age group still speak any German?
Well, I tell you what, a lot of my friends could speak German, but I don't know why my mother and daddy never did teach me to speak German. I wish they had, because I really would have liked to have been able to speak German. But they never did teach me. I don't know, I guess they thought, well, we're over here now in America and we don't need to be speaking German. But my brother could speak some. He wasn't real good at it himself, but he could speak German, and my sister, I think both of them could speak it pretty well. But I was the youngest one. They never did teach me. They would speak German when they didn't want me to know what they were talking about.
Do you know if it was still German like in Germany, or did it develop in its own Texan dialect of German?
Well, it was a high German and low German. Is what the way it was in Germany, but I think ours was a low German. I don't know what the difference was. It's pretty much the same. I guess it's just like East and West Germany might be a little difference. That's the way it was.
You remember roughly what area in Germany your family came from?
Yeah. It came from a little town called Bottenhorn. They pronounce it Button, Bottttern. They pronounce it Button, but of course in English we pronounce it Bottenhorn. And I was over there, and went to the same church congregation, but it wasn't the same building, but it was the same congregation, you know. And we went over there a couple times, and I still have a relative that lives there, and he's been over here several times. I've got a book, they got a book here that you could read sometime, and it tells all about it.
Great. One question we've been wanting people to answer is, can you think of the most memorable event that you had growing up in the Klein, Tomball area?
Oh gosh, there's so many memorable events that I could. One thing I can remember when Tomball first oil well came in, I guess that was 1934, I believe. It was 33 or 34 when the first oil well was brought in up here. It was a Cobb's family. And I can remember that day that we heard about it. And then, of course, I had a number of relatives up here, Scherer family, Ben Scherer and Will Scherer, and Uncle Wilbert Michael. He was married to Scherer, and he had a couple of oil wells on his place. Everybody up here became rich. And we was always hoping that we would have a darn oil well would have come down here in our area, but they did try drilling one time, and I think they could have brought it in, but they didn't. But then in later years they did bring in a gas well, and it was a pretty good gas well. I don't know if, I don't think it's still in existence.
Telling us about the Tice reunion. Tell us how that started.
Well, in 1976, Tice Elementary School had its opening, and of course all the Tices were invited there, and after the ceremony, I asked all of them to stay in there for a little while, and so I asked them if they were interested in having a Tice family reunion, and most of them all said yes. And I said, well, then we're going to need to have somebody to be elected as the president to get it started. So they said, well, you're the president. So I got a committee together then, and then we got it started, and we had the first one in 1977, the year after it opened. And we went over to a place on I-45 called Countryland Dance Hall, and the first one we had 1,000 people attend. And we had it every 2 years after that. The second one was about 800, and it got down to 7 and 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. So it's leveled out pretty much now to 200. We've been having it every 3 years, but we did miss this last year because of COVID. And I don't know when we're going to start again. We might have one this year or maybe next year. But that's how it started.
So later on in your career, it sounded like you worked with the Klein schools?
Yes, I was, in 1967, I had a friend that come over and asked me, he was on the board, he said he was going to get off the board, he'd like to see me run. So I did run, I ran, and I had an opponent, but I won pretty easily. And I stayed on the board for 18 years. And I enjoyed that experience. That was a great experience. And I tell you, it would be very good for our schools if every man, at least man or woman, could serve on a school board for at least 2 years. And we wouldn't have near the problems that we have in the schools now. But it was a very good experience, and I was president 5 times for 3 years in succession. And like I say, it was a very good experience. And then finally, after I retired from the telephone company, the school district was talking about getting someone to take care of the telephones at the school. So I told them I'd like to have that job because I'm going to retire, and I'd like to work a little bit longer. And so I resigned, and then after the first of the year, about February, I think it was actually the same date that I started working for the telephone company, February the 2nd. They hired me to be the telephone man, and I stayed there for 17 years and retired. And I enjoyed that too. That was a very good job.
It sounded like when you were on the school board, you were involved with hiring the new superintendent there?
Dr. Collins, yes, I was. I was instrumental in getting him at Klein. We had I had a school teacher His name was Merle Johnson. That was my school teacher, and he became a assistant superintendent in Houston. They had what they called an area superintendent, and Dr. Collins was the area superintendent. And when our present superintendent had got killed in a car wreck in 1970, we had to start looking for a superintendent. We sent out notice about the superintendent, and the board appointed me to interview the applicants and bring the ones to be interviewed for the full board that I thought would be suitable. Dr. Collins applied for it, and I talked with him, and then I called the past superintendent of Houston. His name was Fletcher. He was one of the best superintendents that Houston had. And he told me, he said, there's no better man that you could pick for that job. And so Merle Johnson, I called him and I told him, Mr. Johnson, now, I don't want you to recommend the man just because of personal reasons or anything. I want to know for sure you've been at Klein, and you know I want a superintendent that we can count on to do a good job. And so Don Collins applied for the job. So I'd like to have your opinion. And he said, Butch, I want to tell you, you can't find a better man for superintendent's job. And so I brought in the three that I thought was best. It was on a Saturday evening. And there was one that was very good. I really liked him. And then there was another one that one of the board members wanted. I didn't think too much of him, but we brought him in anyway. And I brought in the first two, and I let Dr. Collins be the last. And after the second one, somebody said, man, they're all getting better. So I brought Dr. Collins in. And after we got through interviewing him, all the board members started commenting about, man, I'll tell you, I think this is the man. And I never said anything. I let them all talk, and they said, well, Butch, what's your recommendation? I said, well, you all just named him. I think he's our man. So I went out and told him that we wanted him as our superintendent, and I said, can you come out here next Tuesday and meet with us, and we'll discuss the contract and the pay? And he said, yeah, sure will. So he came in and we hired him. And he was one of the best superintendents Klein ever had. He built Klein into one of the finest school districts in the country. And then the next superintendent was a pretty good man. He did a good job.
So going back to Wunderlich Farms, can you tell me a little bit about the Wunderlich family?
Yeah, the Wunderlich family, they came from a town over in Germany, right close to Bottenhorn. It's called Fortingen, and that's where they come from. And they came over here, and one of the Wunderlich stayed with my great-grandfather. I'm sure they knew each other, and ended up he sold 105 acres, I believe, or maybe it was 120 acres, to Peter Wunderlich. Peter Wunnick was one of the men that was killed in this powder mill up here during
The one at Spring Creek Park?
one at Spring Creek Park.
The Confederate powder
Yeah,
mill.
he was one that was killed there, and that we bought that property when I was on the board, and it was with the understanding that the one that was living there was his name was Alphonse, or Alf they called him, and we made agreement with him that he could live there as long as he wanted to, but when he vacated the place, then we would take it over completely. And so he stayed there for a number of years, and then finally he got so old he had to move out, and then we took it over and made a museum out of it.
Is that where the Wonderlick Farms Museum is now? That tract?
Yeah, right. That old house is sitting back there. The old house is a Wonderlick, Peter Wonderlick house.
One other thing mentioned in your book was your dad making homebrew beer. Do you know where he got his recipe for that?
I don't know where he got the recipe from, but I remember that home brew. He made that home brew, and sometimes he'd bottle it, and that doggone beer would blow up. You could hear it pop. The cap hit the top of the tin roof in that smokehouse. That's where he had it.
So, I know you came along after the Great Depression, but what kind of after effects did that have on your life, even when you came around?
Well, I know that one thing, we just didn't have much for Christmas and stuff. You know, you'd get one present, and that would be all. Mother and father wouldn't exchange gifts, or the brothers and sisters. The only one would get it was like a little child like me. And I can remember when I always wanted a bicycle. Gosh, I just wanted a bicycle so bad, and when Santa Claus was supposed to come, usually it'd be in the morning after Christmas Eve. The next morning, the bicycle or whatever gift I got would be under the tree. But this time, when I got that bicycle, I think it was New Year's Eve, but it was in the afternoon. And I was outside, and my mother got that bicycle and put it at the tree. And she said, I came in the house and she said, well, I don't know, I think maybe Santa Claus came while you was outside, and I went in there and there's that bicycle was. Man, I was the proudest person you ever seen.
Another thing I read about in your book was canning food and putting up vegetables. How did they do that?
Canned food?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, we would have a pot that you put water in, and then you seal it, and you'd put vegetables in a jar and put it in there, and then cook it in that pot. And then my mother made sauerkraut, and that's the way she did it. Make that sauerkraut, and you put that sauerkraut in a crock, and then let it stay in there for a while, and then put it in jars. And we had those old jars with a glass top on it and a handle that you pulled up on it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, then later you got the time that you screw down, you know, and she could take those, some of that stuff when she'd can it. She'd put it in that pot that I was talking about, and then when after it cooled down, you could take the top, unscrew it, and that other part would stay on there, stuck to it.
I wanted to ask you about the dipping vats around for.
Oh yeah, the dipping vats. We had an epidemic of fever ticks in Texas, and the state put dipping vats about every 5 miles, and my daddy got a job as a dipping inspector, and they paid $100 a month, and that was pretty good money during those Depression years. And we had one right next to our house. I'd go down there and watch them dip those cattle. Daddy didn't have that vat most of the time. His district was up around Cypress and Barker, Texas. And the dipping vat was about 10 foot deep. And they had a corral around the dipping vat, and then a chute that come up to it, and they'd drive those cows around in that chute, and they'd come up there and they'd have to jump off into that vat, and it would completely cover them, you know, and then there was steps where they could come out. And they were supposed to test that dip, you know. And some of those dipping inspectors, Daddy always took a stick when he went to his vat, and he would stir it up and get that dip that had settled down, you know, and get it stirred up, and then test it. They had a tester, and if it needed to add some more dip, then he would do it. But a lot of those dipping inspectors, they didn't do that. They just went ahead and tested it, showed that they needed some more dip, and they'd put it in there. They would get too much dip in there, and then some of those cows' hair on their back would come off, burn off, and I know Dad had told the story one time that he was assigned to go to a vat up there somewhere around Cypress, and it wasn't his regular vat that he went to, but it was one of the ranchers that didn't bring his cows in to be dipped. So Daddy and them, they had to go out. If the law was that if you didn't bring them in, they'd come and pick them up. And when they got to the gate, that rancher was there with a shotgun. And he said, "You ain't coming in here to get my cows." And my dad said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because they got all the doggone hair burnt off of them on their back." And Daddy said, "Well, I'm sorry, but you're going to have them dipped. And I'm not going to let you in." So Daddy said, "Well, okay." So he left and he went and had to get the law. They come back out there, and the guy, deputy, would tell him, said, "Mr. So-and-so, you're going to have to let us to get those cows." So he said, so they went ahead and got the cows, and sure enough, that vat had enough dip in it that he didn't even have to add any. And he dipped those cows, and none of them have no problem. And a lot of those ranchers up there then, they requested to Harris County that they let my daddy come up there and dip their cattle. And when the cows went down in the ditch, or down in the started to drop off in the water, they had a paintbrush on a stick, and it was green paint, and they'd put it in the bucket and put some paint on it, and they'd put a stripe on top of the back so they would know that they had been dipped, you know.
What chemical were they using to dip them?
I don't remember the name of the stuff.
How did they make the dipping vats? Was it just dug out dirt, or did they have
No, they
concrete?
had it concreted. They, you know, it was about, I guess about 4 foot, 5 foot wide, and they were, like I said, it was about 10 foot deep, and it was concreted, and then they had some steps, like wood steps underneath there, and when they come through that chute, they'd drop off in there, and the water would cover them up, and then they'd go out. And then for the horses, they had to spray them. They'd use a sprayer. But I remember coming down Spring Cypress Road there at our house, they would bring cows down there on a Saturday, maybe during the week. Bring a bunch of cows right down the middle of the road.
I heard stories that some of the ranchers or dairymen did that even up to the 50s or 60s, didn't they? To have to drive the cows down the road instead of hauling them on the highways.
Yeah. But that eliminated the fever ticks, because if they got stung by one of those ticks, they would die.
I wanted to ask about, it sounded like early on in Texas history, there's a lot of malaria around here. You know what they treated the malaria with?
Treated what?
Malaria with in this area?
Yeah, quinine. I had malaria when I was a little boy, and I still remember it to this day. I was just a little boy, I guess probably about 4 or 5 years old. I mean, I still slept in a little bed. And at nighttime, about usually around midnight or 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, I would start screaming and hollering. I can remember it was always a black woman coming after me with a hatchet. And I'd start screaming, and my mother would get up, and she'd have to start washing me down. I'd have fever, you know, and I'd be soaking with, I'd have fever, and then she'd use some alcohol and cold water and bathe me down, and I guess she'd give me that quinine until I finally got started sweating, and then I'd go back to sleep. And it was from mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm. So what were some of the home remedies people used back in the day?
Home
remedies.
Well, we used what they called black drop. That was some kind of medicine, I think they called it. It was kind of a medicine for cough or something. And Raleigh's was the name of it. There'd be a Raleigh's man that'd come around every so often. They would sell vanilla, and it was real good vanilla. And they'd have all kind of stuff like black pepper and salt and other stuff like that you could buy from them.
Any other stories you want to share with us today?
Well, I can't think of much of anything. other than when we got this house, like I said, your daddy was on the board then, and they wanted a house that depicted the era of time, and this here was supposed to be, according to Earl Hilligoss, who was on the board then, he said this was supposed to be one of the oldest houses in the Rose Hill area. And so the house was sitting there empty, and there was some people, it was a lady that owned that property up there, and Millie Martin talked to her about the house, and she agreed that she'd go ahead and get it moved. I mean, she would sell it. Well, we had to pay $8,900. And so we didn't have any money. But anyway, Millie, she had come into somebody, and I think I put up $200 some or something, and Millie was able to put up the other, and we went on and bought it. And Lester Dynick, he helped out on it too. When we got ready to move it, Lester had most of the involvement with getting it moved. We had a man from Conroe that was a house mover, and then there was one up here at Magnolia that moved houses, and the one at Magnolia, he was going to have to cut the house in half, and then take this kitchen area off in order to move it. And then I got another bid from another one, and he had to do the same thing. So Mr. Otis Davis was Assistant Superintendent Klein, and he dealt with Abe Organ movers that moved portable buildings for schools and stuff. And he said, that's the man that's who you ought to get that house moved. He said, you know, y'all, I think that one from Conroe had a $25,000 insurance, you know, coverage in case of an accident or something. Mr. Davis told me, he said, you know, if this mover is bonded and he's insured for like $300,000, and he said, you know, if that something happened, man, these people could sue all the Tices. And so I talked to this Abe Organ movers, and the one up there at Conroe was going to move it for $2,500, which was a real cheap price. Well, he come out and looked at it, and he said, I think he said it'd be $5,000. I said, well, we got a bid for 25. He said, 20, oh man, there ain't no way. I said, well, I guess you're gonna have to take the kitchen off. Oh, what for? I said, well, all the other ones said they'd take it. He said, you know, I don't have to take the kitchen off. He said, they just don't have the equipment I have. He said, the only thing we're going to have to do is take the roof. And so Lester Dynick had an idea. When they take the roof off, these end, you take up there was 4x4 studs, and you could take a big hinge and put it on there and then lay that back down on the top of the roof. And Billy Smith, I think his name was Smith, he said, yeah, that's a good idea. So Lester gave him those big hinges, and that's what he did. When he tore all the boards off, they kept all of the rafters and stuff and laid them down, and then laid that thing over on top of it. And he came out there I think it was on a Wednesday, and they had to wait a while because it was raining so much. So he finally had dried up, and he come out there, and I went up there on I think it was on was it Friday? I think it was a Friday. And he had it jacked up. They were jacking it up. And I said, well, I guess you're going to have to wait till Monday. Nah, we're going to move it tomorrow. He said, I'll have it sit down here at the road by this evening. I couldn't believe it. So we had a meeting that night here, and I came up here to the meeting. And after the meeting, I drove back down there, and there the house was sitting. And the next day they moved it. They came on, of course they got the police in front of them, and they come down. And they come down to where the VA is now. That used to be Klein's store. And he turned down that street and went around and came back up to Baker, and then turned down Baker and then turned down this Ep Street. And he had already went and talked to all the people along here and told them that he might have to, if it was okay if he could take some of the limbs down. Everybody agreed to it. Well, I don't think he had to take any limbs down. But Lester come up here and watched them. And he said, man, I want to tell you, I couldn't believe. We had stobs set down here how we wanted the house to sit, you know. And that guy that was driving that truck, he pulled up there. And the owner, he got back here and he signaled him. He had signals, you know. He got behind him. And that guy, Lester said he backed that thing in here. I mean, right up on to the spot where we had those stakes. He said he didn't have to pull up nothing or straighten out or nothing. He just backed that thing right in there.
Amazing. So you're talking about the rafters. You mean the A-frame of the roof structure? You just hinged it to lay it down?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's wish we had those prices today. If we moved to a building today, it'd cost a heck of a lot more.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you. He was good, and he moved this smokehouse too. Nelson, yeah, Keith. Yeah, his son's name is Keith Nelson. And his name was Billy Nelson, I think. Yeah, they were the one that moved it. And we notified all the Tice family about contributing. And we got enough, we got $23,000. The names are out here in the hallway on a plaque. Some of them gave like $1,000, and their company matched it. And so Lester and his son, they did all the restoring in here. I mean, it was a real good job. All we had to do was get one carpenter to come in here and put down a new porch and nail the roof back up and all that.
Where'd they get all the furnishings for it?
Well, a lot of it is donated. Like in that blue room there's a cousin of mine that donated the bed and various things. This desk right here belonged to a preacher that was a Tice. His name was Tice. He was a Lutheran preacher, and he donated. His family donated this, and then of course then this is here, and various other things was donated.
Great. Put together a really nice museum exhibit here.
Yeah.
Any other stories you want to share with us today, Mr. Tice?
Well, I think I just about covered it all.
Yeah, we sure appreciate you coming in today, and I appreciate your time and sitting for a video. Thank you.
Okay.